Some doors are never knocked on by people. They are chosen by destiny instead. The first sound Grace Bennet heard that stormy night was not thunder rolling across the Blackwood Mountains. It was 3 slow taps against her old wooden door, so gentle that they almost disappeared beneath the steady rhythm of rain. She froze with a loaf of fresh bread still resting in her hands. No one visited her little cottage after sunset. The nearest neighbor lived nearly half a mile away, and the narrow dirt road leading to her home disappeared into the towering pine forest where most villagers refused to wander after dark. They believed the woods belonged to wolves. Grace had never argued with the stories. She simply respected the forest the way her late father had taught her. Every morning she gathered herbs, collected clean spring water, mended clothes for nearby families, and baked enough bread to trade at the village market every Saturday. Her life was quiet, ordinary, and almost invisible. She wasn't a healer. She wasn't a doctor. She knew nothing about ancient remedies beyond the simple lessons every farm girl learned while caring for injured lambs, frightened horses, and exhausted sheepdogs. Yet something about that soft knocking refused to leave her alone. She carefully set the bread on the table and lifted the small oil lantern hanging beside the fireplace. The warm glow reached only a few feet ahead as she crossed the worn wooden floor. Outside, rain fell in silver curtains beneath a sky hidden behind heavy clouds. Another gentle tap echoed through the door. Grace slowly unlocked it. The cold wind slipped inside first, carrying the clean scent of pine needles and wet earth. Then she saw him. A large gray wolf stood quietly on the porch, its thick fur soaked from the rain. One front paw remained lifted off the ground, and tiny burrs clung to its coat after what must have been a long journey through dense brush. The animal's bright amber eyes never left hers. There was no growl, no bared teeth, no threatening movement, only silent exhaustion and cautious hope. Grace's heartbeat quickened. Every sensible thought urged her to close the door. Every story she'd ever heard warned that wolves were unpredictable, but the trembling paw caught her attention. It reminded her of an old sheepdog she had cared for years ago after it wandered home limping through an icy field. Without thinking about the danger, she quietly stepped aside and whispered, "You don't have to be afraid." The wolf remained perfectly still for several long seconds before slowly crossing the threshold. Rainwater dripped onto the wooden floor as Grace gently closed the door behind him. She placed the lantern nearby and knelt several feet away, careful not to invade his space. The wolf lowered himself onto the braided rug near the fireplace with a slow, weary sigh. Grace noticed small thorns tangled around the fur between his toes and a shallow scrape along one leg, likely earned while forcing his way through thick undergrowth. She filled a wooden bowl with warm water, gathered a clean cloth, and spoke softly the entire time, not because she expected the wolf to understand her words, but because kindness had always sounded calmer when carried by a gentle voice. The wolf watched every movement without fear. Grace carefully rinsed away mud, removed each thorn one by one, and wrapped the sore paw with a strip of clean linen from an old flour sack. The entire cottage remained quiet except for the crackling fire and the steady rain outside. When she finished, the wolf rested his head on his front legs and closed his eyes as though the long journey had finally ended. Grace smiled faintly, covered him with an old wool blanket she usually saved for winter deliveries, and returned to her chair beside the fireplace. She never noticed the shadow standing silently beyond the rain at the edge of the forest. Hidden between towering pines, several pairs of glowing amber eyes watched the tiny cottage with perfect stillness before quietly disappearing back into the darkness. Grace woke before sunrise to the familiar scent of fresh bread rising inside the small cottage. The rain had stopped sometime before dawn, leaving the world wrapped in a quiet mist that drifted gently between the towering pine trees beyond her window. She stretched the dough with practiced hands, occasionally glancing toward the fireplace where the gray wolf still rested peacefully on the old braided rug. The bandage around his front paw remained clean, and for the first time since arriving, his breathing seemed slow and comfortable. She smiled without realizing it. Whatever had frightened him enough to travel through the storm had finally faded, at least for one peaceful night. As the first golden rays of morning slipped through the windows, the wolf slowly lifted his head. His amber eyes met Grace's for only a moment before he carefully stood. He tested the injured paw, placing a little weight on it. There was still stiffness, but the sharp hesitation she had noticed the night before was gone. Grace quietly poured fresh water into the wooden bowl and placed a small piece of roasted chicken beside it. She remained several feet away, giving him every opportunity to leave if he wished. Instead, he calmly drank the water before accepting the simple meal with surprising gentleness. There was nothing wild about the way he behaved. Every movement carried patience, almost as though he understood that kindness deserved kindness in return. After finishing, the wolf walked toward the door. Grace opened it without speaking. Cool mountain air drifted inside, carrying the scent of pine needles, damp earth, and wildflowers beginning to bloom along the forest edge. The wolf stepped outside, then paused. For several long seconds he looked back at her. His tail gave one slow, almost grateful motion before he disappeared into the trees without making a sound. Grace stood in the doorway until the forest became still again. She laughed softly at herself. Perhaps the villagers were right about one thing. The woods truly held mysteries no one could explain. She returned to her morning routine, loaded fresh bread into a woven basket, and prepared for the short walk into the village. The marketplace buzzed with familiar conversations as neighbors purchased vegetables, milk, flour, and firewood. Grace greeted everyone with her usual warm smile, yet something felt different. Several people seemed unusually distracted, whispering while glancing toward the distant forest. An elderly farmer mentioned that strange paw prints had appeared near his barn before sunrise. Another woman insisted she had seen several wolves moving together along the northern trail. Grace listened quietly without mentioning her unexpected visitor. She had no desire to become the center of another village rumor. By late afternoon, she returned home carrying a small sack of flour and fresh apples. The cottage welcomed her with peaceful silence. She swept the porch, watered the herbs growing beside the steps, and settled into her favorite rocking chair with a sewing basket resting across her lap. The sun slowly dipped behind the mountains, painting the sky with shades of orange and lavender. Birds settled into the trees. Crickets began their evening songs. Then, just as darkness quietly settled across the forest, she heard it again. 3 gentle knocks. Grace looked toward the door, certain she had imagined them. Another 3 followed, calm and patient. She opened the door slowly. Her breath caught. The gray wolf stood there once more. But this time he was not alone. Behind him waited 2 larger wolves. Between them walked an older silver wolf, moving carefully, one step at a time, leaning slightly as though every movement required effort. None of them showed fear. None of them showed aggression. They simply stood together beneath the evening sky, their calm amber eyes fixed on Grace with quiet expectation. The first wolf took one slow step forward, then looked back toward the older companion before returning his gaze to her. It was almost impossible to misunderstand what they were asking. Grace felt her heart beat a little faster. She whispered to herself with quiet disbelief, "You came back, and you brought someone who needs help." The forest remained perfectly silent, as though it had been waiting all day for this very moment. Grace stepped aside without hesitation. The 3 wolves entered the cottage as quietly as drifting snow, careful not to disturb a single chair or basket. The older silver wolf moved with slow, deliberate steps, favoring one back leg while breathing a little heavier than the others. Grace noticed there was no sign of panic in his eyes, only fatigue that seemed to come from traveling many difficult miles. She quietly closed the door and added another piece of firewood to the fireplace until warm light filled the small room. The first gray wolf she had helped the night before settled near the entrance, watching every movement with calm attention, while the third wolf remained beside the older one as though offering silent reassurance. Grace knelt several feet away and spoke in the same gentle voice she used with frightened horses and abandoned farm dogs. "You are safe here. I will do what I can." She knew she possessed no extraordinary knowledge. She was simply a woman who believed that patience often accomplished what fear never could. She filled another wooden bowl with warm water and gathered clean cloth, fresh linen strips, and a small bundle of herbs she normally brewed into tea. The older wolf never resisted. As Grace carefully examined the sore leg, she realized the animal had strained the muscles during a long journey rather than suffering a dangerous injury. She gently cleaned away dirt, wrapped the leg with soft linen to provide support, and rested a folded blanket beneath the tired body. The wolf slowly lowered his head, releasing what sounded almost like a relieved sigh. Grace smiled softly. Sometimes all anyone needs is a place to rest. The hours passed quietly. Outside, moonlight painted silver lines across the forest while inside the cottage the fire crackled peacefully. Before dawn, all three wolves stood together. The older wolf carefully tested his leg and managed several steady steps. The gray wolf looked toward Grace once more, his amber eyes reflecting the warm firelight. For the briefest moment, she could have sworn gratitude lived within that silent gaze. Then all three disappeared into the mist before the first rooster crowed. Grace believed the unusual visits had finally ended. She could not have been more mistaken. 2 evenings later, another wolf arrived. The following night, there were 2 younger wolves escorting one exhausted companion that had clearly wandered for days without proper rest. Then came a mother wolf with a frightened young pup staying close. Beside her, none of them showed aggression. None damaged her home or frightened the nearby livestock. They simply arrived after sunset, waited patiently while Grace offered warmth, clean water, simple care, and a peaceful place beside the fire, then quietly returned to the forest before sunrise. Soon the narrow path leading to her cottage carried more paw prints than boot prints. It did not take long before the village noticed. Children whispered about mysterious wolves visiting the lonely seamstress. Farmers began finding tracks leading away from Grace's porch each morning. One afternoon, while she delivered freshly mended clothing to the general store, conversation stopped the moment she entered. Curious eyes followed her across the room. An older woman folded her arms and quietly asked whether the stories were true. Grace answered honestly, "They come because they need help. They leave when they are ready." Her simple reply only deepened the mystery. Some believed she possessed a forgotten gift. Others wondered whether the forest spirits had chosen her. A few avoided her entirely, crossing the street whenever they saw her walking through town. Grace never defended herself. She continued sewing clothes, baking bread, collecting herbs, and opening her door whenever another quiet knock arrived after sunset. Far beyond the village, hidden among ancient pines beneath the fading evening sky, a tall man wearing a dark traveling cloak listened silently as trusted scouts described the strange reports spreading across Blackwood. He asked only one question before turning his gaze toward the distant forest. "Has anyone seen this woman harm even one of the wolves?" The answer came immediately. "Never, Your Majesty. They trust her completely." The mysterious traveler looked toward the faint trail leading to Grace's little cottage, and for the first time in many years, genuine curiosity replaced the calm certainty in the eyes of the Alpha King. The following evening arrived wrapped in a quiet blanket of fog that drifted through the towering pines surrounding Grace Bennett's cottage. She had just finished placing fresh bread on the cooling rack when she noticed that the familiar gray wolf had not appeared alone. 5 wolves stood silently near the edge of the clearing, their attention fixed on a single dark figure standing several yards behind them. The stranger wore a weathered traveling cloak that concealed most of his face beneath a broad hood. He carried no lantern, no visible weapon, and made no effort to step closer. Instead, he simply watched as the wolves calmly approached Grace's porch with another tired companion walking carefully among them. Grace glanced toward the mysterious traveler only briefly before kneeling beside the newest visitor. The wolf's thick fur was damp from crossing a shallow creek, and one paw had become irritated after days of walking across rocky ground. She filled her wooden basin with warm water, spoke softly to the animal, and gently cleaned the sore paw before wrapping it with fresh linen. The wolves waited with remarkable patience, never crowding her or showing the slightest sign of unease. From where he stood beneath the tall pines, the cloaked traveler observed every detail without interruption. He noticed how Grace never rushed. She never reached suddenly toward an anxious animal. She always waited for each wolf to close the final distance on its own. More surprisingly, every wolf willingly accepted her quiet presence. After the treatment was finished, Grace carried a bucket of clean water outside and placed it near the porch. One by one, the wolves drank peacefully before lying down in the cool evening grass, as though her small cottage had become the safest place in the forest. Grace finally looked toward the stranger and offered the same warm smile she greeted every visitor with. "You have traveled a long way," she said gently. "Would you like some fresh bread before the night gets colder?" The traveler paused for a moment, almost surprised by the invitation. Most people lowered their eyes when meeting a stranger in the woods after sunset. Grace simply treated him like another weary guest. He slowly approached until the firelight reached his face. He appeared to be a man in his middle 30s with calm silver eyes and an expression shaped by years of carrying responsibility. There was quiet strength in the way he stood, yet there was also something unexpectedly gentle beneath his composed demeanor. Grace handed him a slice of warm bread without asking his name. "There is honey if you would like some," she said. He accepted it with a respectful nod. "Thank you," he replied. His voice was calm and measured, carrying the confidence of someone accustomed to being heard without ever raising it. They shared several peaceful moments listening to the fire crackle while the wolves rested nearby. Grace spoke about the changing weather, the coming harvest, and how the forest always seemed quieter after rain. She never asked why the wolves trusted him enough to let him stand among them. Likewise, the traveler never questioned why they trusted her enough to bring every weary companion to her door. Sometimes silence revealed more than conversation ever could. As the moon climbed higher above the trees, the wolves slowly rose together. The first gray wolf looked toward the traveler before turning his gaze back to Grace. It almost appeared as though the animal were waiting for permission. The man gave the smallest nod. The wolves quietly disappeared into the forest one after another. Before leaving, the traveler looked back at Grace with thoughtful eyes. "You are not afraid of them," he said softly. Grace smiled as she folded the empty linen cloths. "Fear usually arrives when we stop paying attention," she answered. "They have never asked me for anything except kindness." The traveler remained silent for several seconds before inclining his head with quiet respect. As he disappeared into the mist beyond the trees, one thought stayed with him longer than any report his scouts had delivered. For the first time in many years, Alpha King Nathaniel Hayes had witnessed his royal wolves willingly place complete trust in someone who sought neither power nor recognition, and he knew this quiet woman carried a gift that no title could ever explain. Word spread across Blackwood Valley faster than the morning wind. By the end of the week, nearly everyone in the village had heard the same unbelievable story. Wolves were visiting Grace Bennett's cottage almost every evening, yet not a single chicken had disappeared, not one sheep had gone missing, and no fence had been broken. The animals arrived quietly, rested peacefully, and vanished before sunrise as though they respected the little home as much as its owner did. Some villagers began leaving their windows open at night, hoping to catch a glimpse of the mysterious visitors. Others locked their doors earlier than ever, convinced something beyond ordinary understanding was unfolding at the edge of the forest. Grace continued living exactly as she always had. Each morning she baked bread, repaired worn coats, gathered herbs along familiar woodland paths, and greeted every customer with the same gentle smile. She never mentioned the wolves unless someone asked directly, and even then her answers remained simple. "They come because they need a safe place for a little while," she would say. "Then they return home." Many found her calmness difficult to understand. One chilly afternoon, while she carried a basket of fresh rolls toward the village church, two children ran excitedly toward her. "Miss Grace," one of them called, "we saw wolves near your house again last night." She smiled kindly. "Did they frighten you?" The children shook their heads. "No. They only walked into the woods after looking toward your porch." Grace laughed softly. "Then perhaps they were simply saying good night." The children laughed with her before running off across the square. Not everyone shared their curiosity. Several adults gathered outside the general store watched the exchange with uneasy expressions. One man quietly remarked that wild animals should never trust humans so completely. Another insisted that no ordinary woman could earn such loyalty without hidden secrets. Grace overheard every whispered conversation but refused to answer suspicion with anger. She simply continued her errands and returned home before sunset. That evening, the familiar gray wolf appeared once again, followed by several younger wolves that spread themselves around the clearing with quiet discipline. Grace noticed something different immediately. None of them needed help. Their coats were clean, their movements steady, and their eyes bright with quiet confidence. They had not come seeking care. They had come simply to be there. Some rested beneath the old maple tree beside her porch. Others stretched comfortably across the soft grass, while fireflies drifted through the cooling summer air. Grace sat on the wooden steps, holding a cup of warm herbal tea, smiling as though she were surrounded by old friends rather than creatures the village feared. Hidden among the trees beyond the clearing, Alpha King Nathaniel Hayes watched the peaceful gathering without revealing himself. His most trusted advisor stood beside him, equally astonished. "Your Majesty," the older man whispered. "They are not guarding her because she commands them. They remain because they choose to." Nathaniel nodded slowly, never taking his eyes off the quiet scene before him. The royal wolves were trained from birth to recognize danger, deception, and cruelty. They trusted only those whose hearts remained steady even when fear tempted them otherwise. Yet every instinct they possessed drew them back to this small cottage night after night. Grace never called for them. She never offered commands or rewards. She simply welcomed them whenever they arrived. As darkness settled across the valley, the gray wolf walked to Grace's side and gently rested his head against her knee. She smiled, absent-mindedly brushing her fingers through the thick fur while gazing toward the stars beginning to appear overhead. Nathaniel felt something shift deep within him. In all his years as Alpha King, he had witnessed loyalty earned through courage, leadership, and sacrifice. This was different. This loyalty had grown from quiet compassion alone. At that moment, he understood that the wolves had already made their choice long before he ever stepped into the forest, and he realized the time had come to stop watching from the shadows and reveal the truth that only he could tell. The next morning, the valley awakened beneath a clear blue sky, but an unusual feeling lingered in the air, as though the forest itself were waiting for something important to happen. Grace Bennett swept the front porch, watered the small herb garden beside her cottage, and smiled when she noticed fresh paw prints circling the flower beds before disappearing back toward the trees. She quietly laughed to herself. "You never stay away for very long," she whispered. Before she could finish arranging a basket of fresh bread, a familiar knock echoed across the little porch. It was not the gentle rhythm of a wolf this time. Grace opened the door and found the same traveler she had welcomed several nights before. His dark cloak was neatly fastened against the cool morning breeze, yet there was something different about the calm confidence in his silver eyes. "Good morning," Grace said warmly. "You found your way back." The traveler smiled. "I hoped you would not mind another visit." "Everyone is welcome if they arrive with kindness," she answered before inviting him inside. The cottage smelled of warm bread, fresh herbs, and cedarwood from the fireplace. Sunlight streamed through the windows, filling the modest room with soft golden light. Grace poured 2 cups of herbal tea while the traveler quietly admired the peaceful simplicity surrounding him. There were no expensive decorations, no signs of wealth, only shelves filled with carefully folded linen, baskets of freshly baked bread, and small clay pots where herbs dried beside the windows. Every corner reflected patience and care. Before either of them could speak again, several wolves appeared outside the open doorway. They did not rush forward or make a sound. Instead, they sat calmly beneath the maple tree as though waiting for permission to enter. Grace stepped onto the porch with a welcoming smile. "You came early today." The familiar gray wolf approached first and gently rested beside her feet. The others followed, forming a quiet circle around the porch. The traveler watched closely. Every wolf looked first toward Grace before settling peacefully into place. None watched him. None sought his approval. Their complete trust belonged to her. He slowly stood and walked outside. As soon as he reached the center of the clearing, every wolf rose together. Grace looked from the wolves to the traveler with quiet curiosity. The man reached up and lowered the hood from his head. Morning sunlight reflected across his silver eyes as he spoke in the same calm voice she remembered. "Grace Bennett, there is something I should have told you sooner." She listened without fear. "My name is Nathaniel Hayes. I am the Alpha King of Blackwood." The words hung gently in the crisp mountain air. Grace blinked once, surprised but not overwhelmed. She glanced at the wolves, then back at the man standing before her. Suddenly everything made sense. The discipline of the pack, the respect they showed him, and the quiet authority she had sensed from the very beginning. Nathaniel continued, "These wolves are my royal guardians. They have protected our kingdom for generations. They trust almost no one outside our own people." He paused before looking toward the gray wolf resting peacefully beside Grace. "Yet they chose you long before I ever met you." Grace lowered her eyes for a moment before softly answering, I only offered them a warm place to rest." Nathaniel smiled gently. That is exactly why they came. He explained that the royal wolves possessed remarkable instincts, able to recognize fear, cruelty, honesty, and compassion more accurately than any person ever could. They had never once mistaken kindness for weakness. Night after night they had returned because Grace never expected anything in return. She had never tried to tame them, claim them, or gain favor through them. She had simply opened her door. Grace looked around at the peaceful pack gathered beneath the bright morning sky. Some rested comfortably in the grass, while others watched birds crossing overhead. They appeared completely at home. Nathaniel's voice grew softer. Many rulers spend their lives trying to earn loyalty. You received it without asking because your heart offered safety before judgment. Grace felt warmth spread through her chest as she realized the mystery had never been about extraordinary gifts. It had always been about ordinary kindness practiced every single day. As a gentle breeze stirred the pine branches overhead, the gray wolf stepped closer and rested his head lightly against Grace's hand. Nathaniel watched with quiet admiration, knowing that neither crowns nor titles had brought this miracle to life. Compassion had accomplished what power alone never could, and from that peaceful morning forward, both the Alpha King and his wolves understood that the smallest cottage in Blackwood had become the safest place in the entire kingdom. The news that the Alpha King himself had visited Grace Bennett's little cottage spread through Blackwood faster than the changing mountain winds. By the following afternoon, villagers gathered in small groups outside the general store, beside the church, and along the dirt roads that wound between weathered farmhouses. Some could hardly believe the story. Others insisted there had to be another explanation. Grace continued her ordinary routine as though nothing remarkable had happened. She swept her porch, kneaded bread dough, repaired a worn winter coat for an elderly neighbor, and greeted everyone with the same quiet smile she had always carried. She neither spoke of the Alpha King nor repeated the conversation they had shared beneath the maple tree. To her, nothing about kindness had changed simply because someone important had recognized it. As evening approached, an uneasy silence settled over the village. A small group of concerned residents slowly walked toward Grace's cottage. They did not carry anger in their hands, only uncertainty in their hearts. One older farmer finally spoke. "Grace, we do not understand why the wolves choose your home. Some people worry that more will come. They are afraid." Grace listened without interrupting. After a thoughtful moment, she answered softly. "Fear often grows where understanding has not yet arrived. They have never come here to threaten anyone. They only seek a place where they can rest without being judged." Her calm words eased a few worried faces, but not every doubt disappeared. Before anyone could continue, a familiar sound drifted through the cool evening air. Leaves rustled gently beneath the towering pines. One by one, wolves emerged from the forest. The gray wolf appeared first, followed by the older silver wolf whose leg had long since recovered. Behind them came several younger wolves, each walking with quiet confidence. The villagers instinctively stepped backward, their breathing becoming noticeably quicker. Grace remained exactly where she stood. She neither called the wolves nor moved toward them. She simply waited. The gray wolf approached the edge of the clearing before sitting peacefully in the grass. The others followed his example, forming a wide circle several yards away from every person present. None crossed the invisible distance Grace had always respected. None made a threatening movement. The clearing became astonishingly quiet. Even the evening birds seemed to pause. Grace slowly walked toward the center of the open space and knelt beside the gray wolf. He gently lowered his head until it rested against her shoulder. The older silver wolf settled comfortably nearby, while the younger wolves relaxed beneath the trees, their calm presence transforming fear into curiosity. Several children quietly stepped forward beside their parents. One little girl whispered, "They look happy." Grace smiled. "They know they are safe." At that very moment, another figure emerged from the forest path. Nathaniel Hayes walked into the clearing wearing his royal cloak, accompanied only by a single trusted advisor. The villagers immediately bowed in respectful silence. Nathaniel raised one hand with quiet reassurance before speaking. "There is nothing for you to fear today." He looked around the gathering before continuing. "These are the royal wolves of Blackwood. They have guarded this kingdom for generations. They do not choose homes carelessly. and they do not remain where cruelty lives. His eyes turned toward Grace with unmistakable respect. They chose this cottage because they discovered something every kingdom needs more than strength alone. They found compassion. The villagers slowly lifted their heads. Many looked toward Grace with entirely different expressions than they had only moments before. Nathaniel smiled gently as the gray wolf remained peacefully beside her. "The wolves have already shown us what they recognized from the very beginning," he said. "A heart that welcomes the weary without asking who they are becomes a place where hope will always find its way home." As the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the mountains, the fear that had surrounded Grace's cottage for weeks quietly faded with them, replaced by a new understanding that spread through Blackwood more gently than any rumor ever had. Several days passed, and something remarkable began to change across Blackwood Valley. The frightened whispers that had once followed Grace Bennet wherever she walked slowly disappeared, replaced by quiet greetings and genuine smiles. Children no longer pointed nervously toward the forest whenever fresh paw prints appeared along the trails. Instead, they watched with innocent curiosity, hoping to catch a glimpse of the calm gray wolf that often rested beneath the maple tree outside Grace's cottage. Grace noticed the change but accepted it with the same humility that had guided every ordinary day of her life. She still baked bread before sunrise, stitched worn jackets for farmers preparing for the cooler evenings, and collected herbs growing beside the clear mountain stream. The wolves continued to visit, although not always because one of them needed care. Sometimes they simply appeared at sunset, resting peacefully near the porch while Grace read beside the fire or watered the small garden she had planted with lavender and rosemary. Their quiet presence became part of the rhythm of the valley itself. One bright autumn morning, a royal carriage stopped outside her cottage. Grace looked up from hanging freshly washed linen and saw Nathaniel Hayes step down onto the narrow stone path with the same calm dignity she had come to recognize. This time he wore no traveling cloak. Dressed in the formal attire of the Alpha King, he carried himself with quiet authority, yet his warm smile remained unchanged. "Good morning, Grace," he said. "I hope I am not interrupting your work." She smiled in return. "Fresh bread is almost ready. I have learned that unexpected visitors usually arrive at the right time." Nathaniel laughed softly before accepting her invitation inside. As they shared warm bread and herbal tea, he looked around the familiar cottage that had quietly become known throughout the kingdom. "Do you know what people are calling this place now?" he asked. Grace gently shook her head. "The House of Quiet Hearts," Nathaniel replied. "Travelers speak of it with respect. They say that anyone who arrives here carrying fear leaves carrying peace instead." Grace lowered her eyes with a modest smile. "It is only a small home," Nathaniel answered gently. "A peaceful home is never small." Before long, several villagers approached the cottage carrying baskets filled with apples, fresh milk, handmade quilts, and bundles of flowers. An elderly farmer stepped forward first. "Grace," he said with quiet sincerity, "we judged what we did not understand. We believed fear instead of kindness. We wanted to thank you for showing us the difference." Grace accepted none of the gifts for herself alone. She immediately divided the bread she had baked that morning, pouring warm tea for every guest until laughter replaced the awkward silence that once separated neighbors. The wolves watched from beneath the maple tree with peaceful eyes, as though they had expected this moment all along. Nathaniel observed the gathering quietly. No one had ordered these people to come. No royal decree had forced gratitude into their hearts. Change had arrived naturally because one woman's daily kindness had slowly taught an entire community to look beyond fear. As the afternoon sun bathed the valley in warm golden light, Nathaniel stepped onto the porch beside Grace. Together they looked across the fields where children now played freely, while several wolves rested peacefully near the edge of the forest without causing alarm. "You changed more than the wolves," Nathaniel said softly. Grace smiled while watching the children laugh together. "Perhaps they changed us first." Nathaniel nodded in thoughtful agreement. Looking across his kingdom, he realized that compassion had quietly accomplished what countless speeches, laws, and commands never could. It had transformed suspicion into trust, strangers into neighbors, and a forgotten cottage into a symbol of hope that would be remembered throughout Blackwood for generations to come. 1 year later, the little cottage at the edge of the Blackwood forest looked much the same. as it always had. The stone chimney still welcomed the morning sun. The herb garden still filled the air with the fresh scent of rosemary and lavender, and warm loaves of bread still cooled on the wooden windowsill every sunrise. Grace Bennet had accepted neither wealth nor a grand estate after meeting Alpha King Nathaniel Hayes. She chose to remain exactly where her journey had begun, believing that kindness never needed a larger house to become meaningful. Travelers from every corner of the kingdom quietly found their way to her doorstep. Some came carrying tired hearts after long journeys. Others arrived simply hoping to sit for a while beneath the old maple tree where wolves often rested peacefully beside children who no longer feared them. Grace welcomed every visitor with the same gentle smile, a warm meal, and patient conversation. She never claimed to possess extraordinary wisdom. She simply listened before speaking, and somehow that alone helped many people discover the answers they had been searching for. Nathaniel visited often, no longer wearing a disguise or hiding among the trees. Sometimes he came to discuss the kingdom, sometimes to share fresh bread and tea, and sometimes only to enjoy the rare quiet that surrounded Grace's home. Although he remained the Alpha King, he always left his royal title at the gate whenever he stepped onto her porch. There, he was simply Nathaniel, a man grateful that one ordinary act of compassion had reminded him what true leadership looked like. The royal wolves continued their familiar tradition. Whenever one of them grew weary after long patrols through the mountains or needed nothing more than a peaceful night's rest, the pack would quietly appear beneath the maple tree. Grace never questioned why they came. She only opened the door. The wolves, in return, watched over the valley with the same quiet devotion they had always shown. As seasons changed, the people of Blackwood slowly adopted Grace's example. Farmers began helping neighbors without waiting to be asked. Bakers left extra bread for families facing difficult times. Children learned that courage could sound as gentle as a welcoming voice instead of a shouted command. The valley itself seemed warmer, not because the winters had grown shorter, but because hearts had grown kinder. One crisp spring morning, Nathaniel stood beside Grace as the first wildflowers bloomed across the meadow. The familiar gray wolf rested peacefully at their feet, while birds welcomed the new season with cheerful songs. Nathaniel looked toward the little cottage and smiled. "Do you ever wonder why the wolves chose this place first?" Grace watched the sunlight dance across the forest leaves before answering softly. "Perhaps they were never searching for a healer." Nathaniel nodded. "No, they were searching for someone who would open the door before asking who deserved to enter." Grace smiled quietly as the gray wolf gently leaned against her hand. In that simple moment, surrounded by the peaceful forest, the loyal wolves, and the people whose lives had been transformed one quiet act at a time, she finally understood that compassion had never needed a title, a crown, or extraordinary gifts to change the world. It only needed someone willing to answer an unexpected knock with an open heart. Long after new generations inherited Blackwood, parents would still tell their children about the humble woman whose kindness became stronger than fear, whose small cottage became a place of hope, and whose simple decision to care for a weary traveler with 4 paws reminded an entire kingdom that the greatest strength is always found in those who choose mercy before judgment. And on peaceful evenings, when gentle paw prints appeared once again along the forest path, everyone smiled, because they knew that somewhere beyond the trees, kindness was still finding its way home. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end of this story. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What was your favorite moment, and what message or lesson did you take away from Grace and Nathaniel's journey? Share your opinion in the comments below and join the conversation with fellow story lovers. If you enjoyed this tale, please give the video a like, share it with your friends, and subscribe to Alpha's Regret Stories. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss our next exciting story filled with romance, drama, betrayal, and unforgettable twists. See you in the next story.